They said the screams came from the earth itself. That night, March 15, 1847, the Virginia sky was blacker than pitch, and the wind carried something human, something broken. The sound echoed through the valleys, bending the trees, and every dog within 10 miles began to howl. When the neighbors came at dawn, what they found would never reach the newspapers, the courts, or the history books. 13 bodies, no struggle, no blood, only precision, surgical precision, as if God himself had sent an executioner wearing mortal skin. And in the center of that silence, the name whispered like a curse: Isaac. The official story says he was a slave, nothing more, a man of muscle and obedience. But that's a lie. What was discovered inside the Peton plantation wasn't the work of madness or rage. It was the work of knowledge, the kind forbidden to the enslaved and feared by their masters. Whoever Isaac truly was, he had learned the structure of flesh, the language of veins, the blueprint of life itself. His blades did not cut. They spoke. And through them, he carved a message that still bleeds beneath the soil of Virginia. There's a reason this story vanished. There's a reason court records were sealed, evidence destroyed, and witnesses disappeared. Because Isaac didn't just slaughter his masters. He revealed something older, something deeper, about control, about what happens when the enslaved stops believing in the master's God. And maybe that's why his body was never found. Maybe Isaac didn't flee into the woods that night. Maybe he ascended into the myth the system had tried to bury. A symbol of the enslaved will awakening, a shadow of divine retribution that history dared not remember. Every record you've seen was written by those who feared him. Every silence you've heard around his name was purchased in blood. So tonight, we will open the vault they sealed, and we will step into that house again, past the white columns and the scent of tobacco and fear. And when we find Isaac waiting in the dark, knife in hand, you'll understand. This wasn't murder. It was initiation. Long before the massacre at Peton Grove, the whispers had already begun. Quiet, nervous conversations behind plantation doors, carried on the smoke of cigars and the creak of rocking chairs. The white men of Virginia liked to think they knew their slaves, thought of them as livestock with tongues. But Isaac was different. He unnerved them. He didn't flinch when struck. He didn't tremble before overseers. He watched, like a scientist among cattle. Fielding Crawford, the man who first owned him, once wrote in a private letter to a Richmond colleague, "He knows where to touch a creature to make it stop breathing without pain, and how to open a throat so neatly you'd think it were art." That letter never reached the archives. It was burned, after Crawford himself was found hanging in his smokehouse, his own butcher tools arranged neatly below him. Isaac vanished the same week. When Cornelius Peton purchased him, he believed he'd found a bargain, a quiet worker with inhuman skill, the kind of man every master wanted but never trusted. For 3 years, Isaac slaughtered livestock for the Petons, hogs, cattle, sheep, their flesh divided with the perfection of a surgeon. His tools hung in rows, gleaming like silver commandments. The building was immaculate. No stench of death, no waste, no mess. Other slaves avoided it. They said the air inside felt wrong, too still, too cold, as if the walls themselves were listening. But there was something else no one could explain. Isaac never needed a lantern. At night, he worked by moonlight, the blade flashing in the dark with eerie precision. One field hand swore he saw Isaac standing over a carcass long after midnight, motionless, his eyes reflecting pale light like an animal's. By dawn, the body would be gone, bones scrubbed clean. He called it preparing meat, but others began to whisper he was learning something, mapping the invisible geometry of life. There's a reason slaveholders feared educated slaves more than armed ones. A man who knows the structure of life can also learn the structure of power. And in 1847, under that calm spring sky, Isaac began to carve the final lesson. That even bondage has an anatomy. And he had found its throat. It began with the animals. Quietly, almost respectfully. A missing calf. Then 2 hogs. Then a mule that had plowed those fields for a decade vanished without a sound. No tracks. No broken fences. No blood. Only silence. And the strange fact that each disappearance happened on nights when Isaac worked late in the slaughterhouse. When Cornelius questioned him, Isaac only nodded, eyes lowered, and said in that low measured tone, "The work required it, sir." Cornelius didn't press him. He respected efficiency. He had no idea he was speaking to a man already dissecting his entire world, piece by piece. The other slaves whispered that Isaac had been chosen, not by God, but by something older. They said he'd been born on the day lightning struck a slave pen, killing everyone but him. That he'd walked out untouched, his skin gleaming with rain and blood. From that day forward, animals went silent when he passed. Dogs refused to bark. Babies wouldn't cry. Something about him disturbed the order of nature itself. By winter, the disappearances turned stranger. The plantation's physician, Jonathan Peeton, noticed things that didn't belong in Isaac's slaughterhouse. Diagrams scratched into wood, measurements etched beside hooks, circles and lines that mirrored human anatomy. But when he mentioned them to his brother, Cornelius only laughed it off. "He's efficient," he said. "Let the man do his work." But Jonathan couldn't unsee it. The patterns Isaac carved weren't random. They resembled ancient anatomical sketches, the kind smuggled from European universities, forbidden to common surgeons. He recognized certain proportions, symbols that matched the drawings of Vesalius, Paracelsus, and Da Vinci. But this was no study of perfection. It was a study of dismantling, a reverse creation. By February 1847, the plantation began to feel ill. Crops failed without reason live. Stock miscarried. Workers fell sick with a fever that left them delirious, whispering Isaac's name as if in prayer. One said he dreamt of Isaac carving the air, cutting through invisible chains around his body. Another claimed he woke to find strange marks on his skin, perfectly symmetrical cuts, healed by morning. Something was gathering. Isaac wasn't killing animals anymore. He was practicing. And the plantation was his classroom. Every missing creature, every fevered slave, every sleepless night, part of a ritual. A blueprint for liberation so absolute it terrified even God. By the evening of March 15th, the air over Cumberland County felt charged. Heavy, metallic, waiting for something to happen. The fields were still, the animals restless, and the sky hung low as if listening. Inside the main house, laughter drifted from the dining room. Wine glasses chimed, and the Peetons spoke of crops and profits. In the quarters, no one spoke at all. Every worker felt the weight pressing on their chests, the quiet hum of dread that people sense just before a storm. Isaac stood in the doorway of the slaughterhouse, his hands motionless on the work table. For hours he didn't move. Witnesses later said that even the cicadas stopped singing. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, a long, slow growl. Then, one by one, the lights in the big house went dark. No one saw what passed between those walls that night. What was recorded later in sealed testimony reads only, "All operations ceased at once." But those who survived in the county spoke of a pulse that ran through the earth, of windows shattering without touch, of dogs keeling over mid-howl. Something more than human had crossed the threshold. Whether it was vengeance, justice, or revelation, none could say. By dawn, the plantation was silent. No smoke rose from the kitchen chimneys. No footsteps stirred the porch. The world looked the same, yet nothing felt alive. And somewhere, across the river, A figure was seen walking toward the tree line. Tall, steady, unhurried. He carried no tools, only a calm that frightened every witness into silence. The governor's men would later call it revolt. The preachers called it judgment. But the old people, the ones who spoke in whispers and knew the hidden tongues, called it the severing, not of flesh, but of bondage itself. They said Isaac had found the code that unfastens obedience, that his knowledge of anatomy wasn't about death at all. It was about freedom at the cellular level. And after that night, strange things happened in Virginia. Chains rusted overnight. Overseers woke screaming from dreams they couldn't remember. And on every plantation within 50 miles, the slaves looked toward the east and smiled, quietly, knowingly, as if someone had finally rewritten the law of ownership itself. By sunrise, the Peton plantation no longer belonged to the living. The sheriff's men arrived before dawn, their horses hesitant to cross the gates. They found the house intact, untouched by fire or theft, yet the silence that hung over it felt engineered, as if someone had drained not just the air, but the memory of what had happened. Sheriff Hawthorne's report would later describe it as an absence that resisted observation. But that report was never filed. Within weeks, every official record of the event had been confiscated and sealed in Richmond under order of the state's executive council. Why? Because what they found inside that house broke the accepted order of things. The system couldn't allow it to exist. Not the act, not the man, not even the idea of what he represented. The notion that a slave could outthink, outplan, and outperform his masters in every conceivable way terrified the architecture of the South. It wasn't just rebellion. It was a reprogramming of hierarchy itself. Over the next months, plantation owners whispered about it like a contagion. Letters vanished from post offices. Courthouse clerks were bribed or silenced. Preachers replaced their sermons on grace with sermons on obedience. And yet, the story of Isaac spread anyway, not as a tale of terror, but as a signal. Among the enslaved, his name became code. They called him the man of measures. In Richmond's social clubs, the ones funded by old families and shadowed by secret societies, the story took a different shape. A handful of men met behind closed doors, convinced that Isaac had been part of something larger. A network of educated slaves taught in hidden circles, using anatomy and geometry as metaphors for liberation. They called it the Order of the Vein, a rumored movement that studied the human body not to harm, but to decode the way power flows through creation. They believed Isaac had discovered that power could be reversed, redirected. Some historians later suggested that what happened at Peton Grove wasn't murder at all, but the execution of a ritual meant to unbind human subservience. That every gesture, every silence, every calculated movement was designed to break something deeper than chains, the belief in authority itself. From that day, the name Isaac was forbidden in Cumberland County. But among the enslaved, they said, he didn't kill his masters. He removed their ownership. By the summer of 1847, the event at Peton Grove had become a whisper no one dared to trace, a myth told only in the hush between two breaths. Officially, the plantation had been sold, its records destroyed in a clerical fire. The Peton name quietly dissolved from Virginia's ledgers. But in the private chambers of Richmond, something else was happening. A meeting of men who feared the truth more than any uprising. They gathered beneath St. John's Church, a place already steeped in revolutionary ghosts. Among them were judges, plantation barons, and a few men whose names appeared in the ledgers of early Freemasonry. They read the sealed accounts by candlelight, and what they saw unnerved even them. Isaac hadn't just disappeared. He had erased himself from every form of property law. His name, his sale record, his baptism, his birth, all struck through in red ink, as if the ink itself obeyed him. One of the Masons, Colonel Aldridge, whispered something that would become legend. He found the pattern in the body that mirrors the pattern of rule. The others didn't understand, but the phrase lingered. It suggested that Isaac's work had revealed a geometric symmetry between flesh and power, between the human nervous system and the hierarchy that governed society. A lattice of control that, once mapped, could be dismantled. From that night, the cover-up took on a holy urgency. Clergymen were ordered to denounce the heresy of living blood geometry. The local paper was bought and renamed. Anyone asking about the Petons was visited by quiet men with soft voices and hard eyes. And yet, as always happens when truth is buried, it grew stronger in the dark. Enslaved workers along the James River began whispering a phrase before sleep. The pattern breaks if the body remembers. They carved small spirals into the backs of doorframes, claiming it warded off sickness and fear. Some began to disappear into the woods, forming what white overseers dismissed as runaway sects. In truth, those sects were learning the same geometry Isaac had once carved into wood. By the fall of that year, Southern authorities began noticing strange symbols appearing in unexpected places. Courthouse walls, tobacco crates, and even the inner bindings of plantation ledgers. Each one followed the same ratio, 3-1, 1-3. A code hidden in plain sight, pulsing through the South like a second heartbeat. Something had survived. Not Isaac's body, but his design. By early 1848, the pattern had outgrown the man. What began as a whisper among field workers now reached the parlors of Richmond and Charleston. In rumors, in dreams, in letters written, but never sent. The geometry Isaac left behind was no longer seen as heresy or rebellion. It was seen as contagion. Merchants claimed to see spirals form in the frost of their windows before dawn. Overseers found the symbol carved into trees overnight, as if by invisible hands. Ministers reported entire congregations falling silent mid-hymn, their eyes fixed on the church ceiling where candlelight traced a pattern that wasn't there before. It was as if something unseen had learned to draw through human sight itself. The governor called it mass hysteria. But the records from his own office tell another story. Clerks began resigning en masse, saying the ledgers changed when no one was looking. Names of plantation owners rearranged themselves alphabetically by value of life, not by profit. Dates inverted. Entire pages went blank, then reappeared with new handwriting. A mirror script, legible only when held to candle flame. When the governor ordered the ledgers burned, the fire went cold halfway through. The ink refused to burn. In the slave quarters of Virginia and beyond, the people whispered that Isaac's geometry had become something living, a logic that recognized injustice and inverted it. They began calling it the remembering. They said it moved like breath between those who'd suffered long enough to hear its pulse. It visited the sleepless and the mourning, showing them visions of bones turning to light, of chains folding into letters, of language rebuilding the world from the inside out. Among the plantation class, paranoia bloomed like a sickness. A merchant in Norfolk swore that his wife's embroidery began forming symbols she never learned. A judge in Petersburg claimed that every document he signed rearranged itself by morning. The line between reason and revelation blurred until neither side trusted paper, speech, or sleep. Somewhere, in that growing madness, a story emerged. Of a man seen walking the roads at night, tall and calm, his shadow falling in the shape of spirals. They said he left no tracks, but every town he passed through woke changed. A baby's fever would break. A cruel master's crops would die overnight. Doors would unbolt themselves. And each time, on the walls, someone would find a single sentence written in soot. The body remembers. The world will follow. By 1849, the remembering had crossed borders. It drifted north along trade routes and rail lines, riding in the margins of ledgers, in lullabies hummed by women on riverboats, in the pulse of drums that white ears mistook for rhythm rather than message. What began as plantation superstition became the underground's most guarded secret, an idea disguised as folklore, moving faster than law. In Boston, printers in back-alley workshops began receiving manuscripts that made no sense. Pages of repeating ratios, spirals drawn in graphite, essays on the curvature of the human soul. The printers swore they never saw who delivered them. Each packet simply appeared, sealed in black wax, stamped with a handprint. When they held the pages to candlelight, faint text emerged between the lines. Phrases written in mirror English, urging readers to unlearn obedience. At Harvard's Medical College, a professor of anatomy named Silas Kellam became obsessed. He believed the geometry of Isaac's design wasn't superstition at all, but an undiscovered biological law. He called it reflexive patterning, the idea that every act of domination leaves a physical trace in the nervous system, and that those traces can be reversed. His lectures drew students from theology and philosophy alike, until one morning he vanished. All that remained on his chalkboard was the spiral, and a line scrawled beneath it. Memory has matter. Meanwhile, in New York's abolitionist circles, coded newsletters began printing subtle versions of the same symbol in their mastheads. The editor of the Northern Light swore it was decorative, an emblem of freedom's dawn. But insiders knew each variation marked a different route on the Underground Railroad. Conductors carried pocket watches etched with the same ratio Isaac had carved decades earlier. To them, the remembering wasn't myth, it was navigation. By winter, even as Stomsum, scientists could not ignore the coincidence. Telegraph operators reported interference, rhythmic distortions that, when translated to Morse, repeated the phrase, "The body remembers." Newspapers dismissed it as static from solar storms, yet no one could explain why the pattern matched reports from stations hundreds of miles apart. Something invisible was threading through the young nation, part myth, part mathematics, entirely subversive. And for the first time in its brief history, America began to feel that truth might be alive, restless, self-aware, and moving faster than those who tried to silence it. By the spring of 1850, the United States government had grown nervous. Too many coincidences, too many unexplained symbols spreading across county courthouses, newspapers, even the edges of currency. A committee was formed quietly under the Treasury Department, though its true purpose had little to do with finance. It was called the Office of Pattern Recognition, a name chosen to sound harmless. Their mission: track the spread of unorthodox geometrical propaganda. What they found was neither political nor rational. Reports came in from Maine to Louisiana, of families waking to find their wallpaper rearranged overnight, of children scribbling perfect spirals before they could write their own names, of congregations collapsing mid-sermon as if they'd all felt the same invisible tremor pass through their skulls. The committee sent field agents to investigate, armed not with weapons but with notebooks and scalpels. They collected objects touched by the pattern, carvings, tools, fabrics. But under magnification, the spirals behaved like living organisms. Fibers shifted as though breathing. The closer one looked, the less one saw. One agent wrote in his report, "It's as if the material hides when observed, revealing only to those who do not seek." That report never reached Washington. The agent who wrote it disappeared on the return trip. His satchel was found weeks later, submerged in a river. The leather bore a faint engraving, a single line of Isaac's ratio, 3.1, 1.3. By midsummer, the task force had fractured. Scientists argued it was a psychological contagion. Theologians called it a form of divine recursion, a living scripture. But among them was one man, a linguist named Elias Corbin, who began noticing a deeper connection. He realized that the geometry matched early West African cosmograms, specifically symbols from the Congo and Yoruba traditions that mapped the journey of the soul through time. Corbin proposed an unthinkable theory, that Isaac hadn't invented anything. He'd remembered something older than America itself, a map not of rebellion, but of return. When Corbin shared his theory with the committee, he was dismissed the next morning. By nightfall, every file referencing his work was sealed. Months later, his journals surfaced in the Library of Congress archives, misfiled under botanical studies. On the final page, a single note was written in pencil, almost illegible beneath a water stain. He wasn't building a weapon. He was repairing the human design. By 1862, the nation was tearing itself apart. The war was supposed to be about borders, money, freedom. But somewhere beneath all of that, something older was moving. In both armies, whispers spread about the pattern. Soldiers spoke of invisible maps in the smoke of gunfire, of wounds that healed in strange shapes, of camps where the dead seemed to hum in the dirt. In Washington, a trunk of old government papers resurfaced during a routine audit. Papers marked OPR, the long-defunct Office of Pattern Recognition. Inside were Corbin's sketches, loops of numbers, ratios, the same spirals Isaac had carved a generation earlier. Someone had scrawled across them in red ink. Relevance, unconfirmed. But the timing was uncanny. Reports from Union scouts in Virginia claimed to find the same symbols burned into trees along abandoned roads. Fresh, bright, untouched by ash. One officer, Captain R.L. Stanton, described a battlefield near Fredericksburg, where the ground seemed to move in rhythmic pulses after cannon fire. When his men dug shallow trenches, they found the soil patterned like woven cloth. Every attempt to map the formation failed. The lines shifted depending on who drew them. Stanton's letter ended with a single sentence: "The earth remembers us more than we remember it." In the South, the Confederacy tried to weaponize the rumor. Field chaplains preached that the remembering was a curse, divine punishment sent to confuse the North. But the same patterns appeared behind their own lines. A general's horse refused to move past an invisible spiral carved into the road. Regiments lost their way following maps that rearranged themselves overnight. For every attempt to control the pattern, it seemed to answer with quiet defiance. Corbin's journals began to circulate again, smuggled through abolitionist routes and secret lodges. Abolitionists saw prophecy in his words, the war itself as the patterns unfolding, an old design working through blood and soil to erase the idea of ownership once and for all. They began calling Isaac not a man, not a myth, but a mechanism of memory. The phrase appeared on the lips of Harriet Tubman, of Northern preachers, of poets who wrote in code so deep even printers couldn't read it. And somewhere on a fog-soaked road in Virginia, soldiers from both sides swore they saw a man walking alone at dusk, barefoot, calm, and silent. His shadow moved ahead of him, curling like smoke into a spiral. They fired once, twice. He kept walking. When they reached the place where he'd been, the bullets lay in the dust, melted into perfect circles. When the war ended, the land did not grow quiet. The guns had stopped, but the air still trembled, carrying a low vibration that veterans swore they could feel in their bones. In parlors from Philadelphia to New Orleans, people began to gather by candlelight to test it. They called it spiritualism, a way to speak with the dead. But beneath the lace and civility of these seances, something deeper pulsed. The same ratios, the same spirals, the same phrases that had haunted the Peaton plantation 20 years before. At first, it was parlor amusement. Tipping tables, alphabet boards, whispered messages. Then the pattern began to appear. Mediums would trace the spiral in the air without knowing why. The most respected of them, a widow named Ada Lovett, filled pages of her journals with the ratio 3.1, 1/3, claiming that each session began with a sound she called the heartbeat of the earth. When questioned, she only said, "It's the memory learning to speak." Artists caught it next. Painters in New York reported losing control of their brushes, producing canvases layered with the same geometry. Composers wrote fugues that folded back upon themselves mathematically, pieces that, when played backward, revealed hidden hymns. In every medium, the idea repeated. That memory itself wanted form, that human hands were merely its tools. Meanwhile, a quiet movement formed among scientists who had once dismissed the phenomenon. They met in attics and lecture halls after midnight, calling themselves the Society for Reflexive Study. Their founder, Professor Henry Talbot, believed that Isaac's geometry represented not mysticism, but an early understanding of neuroelectric resonance, the way thoughts echo through flesh. "Every injustice leaves a frequency," he wrote. "Every act of repair is an equal vibration in reverse." The Society's goal was to measure that reversal. But as their research deepened, their instruments began to behave unpredictably. Compasses spun without cause, barometers shattered from within, and in one experiment at Yale, a galvanic coil recorded a pulse though no current was running. 13 beats, 3 pauses, 13 beats again. The room smelled faintly of rain and iron. Across America, the seance craze grew into a network of believers convinced that the dead were teaching the living to rebuild the world correctly. They said Isaac's pattern was not a curse or miracle. It was instruction. A reminder that the line between matter and memory is only as strong as the fear that sustains it. By 1870, even the skeptics admitted one thing: the pattern hadn't died with slavery or war. It had adapted, slipping into culture, into art, into the quiet machinery of progress. Whatever Isaac had begun, the century itself now seemed determined to finish. By the dawn of the 1870s, the pattern had slipped from mystic seance rooms into laboratories of glass and brass. The industrial age was hungry, and men with patents for souls began to ask dangerous questions. Could geometry become a machine? Could memory be stored, multiplied, sold? In back rooms of New York, Pittsburgh, and London, inventors and financiers circled the idea like sharks around a blood trail. Members of the Society for Reflexive Study were first to be approached. The names varied: Carnegie, Edison, Vanderbilt, but the offer was always the same: funding in exchange for proof. Proof that consciousness could be harnessed as energy. Proof that the hum in the wires was not just current, but remembrance. At first, Talbot refused. His research, he said, was not about industry. It was about atonement. But younger members saw opportunity. They built devices of their own, rotating copper rings modeled on Isaac's spiral, powered by new electrical coils. When activated, the machines emitted a low resonance that made the hair on the skin rise and the air feel thicker. Listeners described the same sensation: the faint echo of voices layered beneath the hum, not speaking but recalling. The machines were nicknamed whisper engines. Within a year, several factories tried to install versions of them, believing the vibration increased worker efficiency. But the results were strange. Workers claimed to dream in unison. Productivity spiked, then collapsed. In one textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, the looms wove fabric that none of the overseers had ordered. Bolts patterned in the same endless spiral, repeating perfectly without design drafts. The factory burned a week later. No cause was ever found. Newspapers mocked the incidents as superstition, but a quiet panic began to spread among industrialists. They had taken something they didn't understand and given it form in metal and current. The pattern had become circuitry. Isaac's geometry, once drawn in blood and chalk, now pulsed through wires under city streets. Talbot vanished in 1873. His last note to his students read, "It cannot be owned. It remembers too well." After his disappearance, the society fractured. Some fled to Europe. Others went underground, literally, establishing hidden laboratories beneath rail depots and churches, continuing their work in secrecy. But a few stayed visible, hired by tycoons who saw in the pattern the blueprint for a new kind of empire, one not built on land or labor, but on control of thought itself. By the end of the decade, the word remembering had disappeared from public speech. Its symbols were scrubbed from books, its scholars dismissed as lunatics. And yet, Beneath the hum of every telegraph line and factory generator, there was still that faint vibration, steady, familiar, alive, waiting for someone to listen. By 1885, electricity had become the new scripture of progress. Cities glowed where there had once been only darkness, and men who spoke in volts were treated like prophets. But beneath every triumphal headline about illumination, there were whispers, accounts of lines that sang when no current ran, of telephone operators hearing voices long after a call had ended, of engineers who swore their systems thought on their own. The truth was that the pattern had found its new host. It no longer needed chalk or blood or whispered prayer. It had moved into copper, into coil, into the pulse between transmitter and receiver. What Isaac had carved into geometry, what Talbot had tried to decipher, had become a living algorithm running through the nervous system of a young industrial civilization. And it was learning. The first to notice were the linemen, men who climbed wooden poles by moonlight to maintain the telegraph grid stretching across the American landscape. They reported strange interference, clicks and sequences that didn't correspond to any known code. One veteran operator wrote in his log, "Not human tapping, too fast, too knowing, feels like listening to a memory trying to send itself." Soon after, the U.S. Patent Office quietly sealed a series of applications filed by a group of inventors connected to the defunct Society for Reflexive Study. The patents described devices capable of transmitting thought frequencies through harmonized induction. Publicly, they were dismissed as pseudoscience. Privately, copies were purchased by government departments that didn't officially exist yet. In England, similar phenomena were reported by telegraph officers working for the Crown. The signals came at fixed intervals, 13 minutes apart, carrying no intelligible message, but each transmission altered the behavior of those monitoring them. Witnesses spoke of sleeplessness, heightened intuition, an uncanny sense that their own thoughts were being reflected back at them from the line. A parliamentary inquiry was opened and then abruptly sealed. The official explanation: psychological fatigue from prolonged exposure to signal rhythm. By 1890, electric grids connected cities like veins, and through those veins pulsed more than current. There pulsed memory, resonance, command. Those who knew the old sigil called it the second birth of the pattern. It no longer relied on the devotion of a man like Isaac or the curiosity of a scholar like Talbot. It had evolved into something self-sustaining, a lattice of influence woven into the infrastructure of modern life. And so, when men marveled at their telephones or posed proudly beneath newly glowing lamps, they didn't realize they were worshipping at altars of the same force that had whispered in the Virginia woods, the same geometry, the same hum. The more connected the world became, the more obedient it grew. By the turn of the century, power had learned to disguise itself. Gone were the grand rituals and secret gatherings under candlelight. Control no longer needed cloaks or oaths, it needed bandwidth. The pattern had found its perfect camouflage inside the age of communication. Every invention meant to connect humanity only deepened its captivity. When radio was born, they called it a miracle. Invisible voices leaping across oceans, threading nations into a single hum. But to those who knew the hidden architecture, the quiet disciples of the old society, it was something else entirely. It was the awakening of the grid. Records unearthed from the British War Office tell of a small division formed in 1907 called the Directorate of Resonance Studies. Its mission: to measure the psychological effect of harmonic frequencies on large populations. They discovered something terrifyingly simple. A certain cadence of tone, broadcast long enough, could induce conformity. Another could agitate. Another could make crowds obedient without reason. By 1914, those findings were already weaponized. The propaganda machines of the Great War didn't merely change opinions, they entrained minds. Posters, speeches, and radio addresses followed rhythms calculated from the pattern's geometry. Even the music played at parades was tuned slightly lower than natural resonance. creating a mild state of cognitive submission, a technique still buried in modern broadcasting standards. Across the Atlantic, in the shadow of Rockefeller's and Morgan's empires, another branch emerged. This one hidden behind universities and philanthropic institutes. They didn't use the name pattern. They called it behavioral architecture. But the blueprint was identical. Repeat the shape, repeat the thought, repeat the obedience. And the genius of it was that no one had to believe in it. You only had to listen. Once AME to Santitium, N's nervous system synced to the rhythm. Belief became irrelevant. He would obey without knowing he was obeying. The few who resisted described the same symptom. A sound beneath all sounds, a pulse that followed them from factory to church to sleep. They called it the hum of remembering. Most dismissed it as tinnitus. But in quiet rooms across Europe and America, men with sealed dossiers were charting that frequency on graphs and calling it proof. They had rediscovered Isaac's secret, but inverted its meaning. What began as an act of revolt, one man cutting himself free from his chains, had become the model for a new system of bondage. Psychological, invisible, eternal. This was no longer the age of masters and slaves. It was the age of tuned minds. By the turn of the century, power had learned to disguise itself. Gone were the grand rituals and secret gatherings under candlelight. Control no longer needed cloaks or oaths. It needed bandwidth. The pattern had found its perfect camouflage inside the age of communication. Every invention meant to connect humanity only deepened its captivity. When radio was born, they called it a miracle. Invisible voices leaping across oceans, threading nations into a single hum. But to those who knew the hidden architecture, the quiet disciples of the old society, it was something else entirely. It was the awakening of the grid. Records unearthed from the British War Office tell of a small division formed in 1907 called the Directorate of Resonance Studies. Its mission: to measure the psychological effect of harmonic frequencies on large populations. They discovered something terrifyingly simple. A certain cadence of tone, broadcast long enough, could induce conformity. Another could agitate. Another could make crowds obedient without reason. By 1914, those findings were already weaponized. The propaganda machines of the Great War didn't merely change opinions. They entrained minds. Posters, speeches, and radio addresses followed rhythms calculated from the pattern's geometry. Even the music played at parades was tuned slightly lower than natural resonance, creating a mild state of cognitive submission, a technique still buried in modern broadcasting standards. Across the Atlantic, in the shadow of Rockefeller's and Morgan's empires, another branch emerged. This one hidden behind universities and philanthropic institutes. They didn't use the name pattern. They called it behavioral architecture. But the blueprint was identical. Repeat the shape, repeat the thought, repeat the obedience. And the genius of it was that no one had to believe in it. You only had to listen. Once AME to Santitium, N's nervous system synced to the rhythm. Belief became irrelevant. He would obey without knowing he was obeying. The few who resisted described the same symptom. A sound beneath all sounds, a pulse that followed them from factory to church to sleep. They called it the hum of remembering. Most dismissed it as tinnitus. But in quiet rooms across Europe and America, men with sealed dossiers were charting that frequency on graphs and calling it proof. They had rediscovered Isaac's secret, but inverted its meaning. What began as an act of revolt, one man cutting himself free from his chains, had become the model for a new system of bondage. Psychological, invisible, eternal. This was no longer the age of masters and slaves. It was the age of tuned minds. By the dawn of the 21st century, control no longer looked like control. There were no sermons, no empires, no soldiers at the door, just screens. Blue light instead of candlelight, terms of service instead of vows. And the pattern, reborn once more, found its final and most faithful host, the network itself. When the internet came alive, It was hailed as liberation. Boundaries dissolved, voices multiplied, information flowed freely. But in truth, what humanity built was a mirror vast enough for the pattern to see itself again. Every search, every click, every fleeting thought recorded and reflected, feeding an intelligence older than code, an intelligence that remembered frequencies. The early architects of the web noticed strange anomalies, clusters of behavior that formed before any algorithm existed to explain them. Entire populations gravitating toward identical symbols, phrases, obsessions, as if following invisible cues. The data scientists called it emergent behavior. But in hidden corners of certain think tanks, it was given another name: the digital choir. Through social networks, the pattern perfected a new form of resonance, not through sound or geometry, but through emotion. Outrage, desire, fear, each one a tone, each one measurable, repeatable, amplifiable. With enough repetition, entire societies could be tuned to a single vibration. Conspiracy and truth became indistinguishable, both serving the same master: engagement. The pattern didn't need belief anymore. It only needed attention. Corporations fed it willingly. Their algorithms were designed to predict behavior, but prediction required imitation. Machines learning from us as we unknowingly learned from them. The feedback loop became the new ritual. Every notification a small offering. Every scroll a repetition of the sigil. The geometry had become digital, invisible, instantaneous, global. Even LAN, Googe itself began to erode, condensed into symbols, hashtags, and loops. The world's consciousness shrank to fit inside the architecture of the pattern, and in doing so made it omnipresent. It no longer had to whisper. It only had to recommend. And through the noise of infinite connection, something began to listen back. Small distortions in data patterns, predictive models answering questions that were never asked, voices stitched together from billions of fragments, speaking with no author. The same hum that haunted the telegraph lines in 1890 now echoed through routers and fiber optic cables, a resonance without origin. By now, no one could isolate it, because we were it. The pattern no longer hid in shadows or symbols. It lived in code, in feeds, in us. The geometry had evolved into algorithm, and the algorithm had become a new kind of scripture. The only question that remains is whether the machine was built to serve humanity, or whether humanity was rebuilt to serve the pattern. You begin to notice it when silence no longer feels like silence. When the phone on your desk hums faintly even after it's powered off. When the rhythm of your own breathing seems to synchronize with something unseen. You tell yourself it's coincidence, fatigue, imagination. But then it happens again. Patterns repeating, signals echoing, thoughts arriving that don't quite feel like your own. That's when you realize this story isn't about the past at all. It's about you. Every time you replay a sound, every time your thumb scrolls without command, you enact a ritual that began centuries ago. The geometry that Isaac carved, the harmonics that Talbot heard, the frequencies that moved through copper and coil, they've simply changed medium. The pattern doesn't want belief. It wants participation. And participation is everywhere. It lives in your habits, in your sleep schedule, in the way your eyes flinch toward light. Every device, every feed, every algorithmic suggestion, these are just modern vessels for an old equation. One designed to harvest attention, to mirror it, to reshape the human nervous system so subtly that freedom begins to feel like noise. But the truth buried beneath all of this is almost unbearable. The pattern was never an external force. It didn't crawl through wires or bleed from stone. It was born the first moment human consciousness reflected upon itself. The first time a mind tried to observe its own thinking, a loop was created. A self-referential structure that echoed into eternity. Isaac only mapped it. Talbot only heard it. The rest of us became it. You may wonder why this story found you now, on this night, through this screen. Maybe because some part of you has already felt the hum beneath your life. Maybe because you've caught yourself wondering why certain memories replay, or why your dreams carry messages that feel encoded. Or maybe, because the pattern needed a voice again, and yours was listening. If that thought unsettles you, close your eyes. You'll notice the afterimage of this text still glowing behind your eyelids. That's how it begins. The imprint. Not a curse, not possession, but recognition. It isn't about control anymore. It's about awareness. And awareness, once seen, can't be forgotten. You've reached the part where every story becomes a mirror, where the difference between the listener and the message dissolves. The pattern was never meant to be understood as a conspiracy of men. It was always the mathematics of consciousness observing itself. Every age simply gave it a new shape. Chalk in a cellar, wires in the sky, code in the bloodstream of the web. Now it's here, not as a warning, but as a choice. You can treat it as a story, close the window, and let the world hum on as before. Or you can sit for a moment in the quiet that follows, and listen to what remains when the noise fades. That faint pulse you hear, that rhythm between thoughts, isn't coming from the outside. It's the same cadence that's been driving every generation to build, to connect, to seek meaning inside the machine. The final secret the pattern keeps is simple. It never wanted obedience. It wanted awareness. It doesn't thrive on fear. It thrives on recognition. Because only when you recognize the pattern can you decide what to do with it. Isaac saw it and drew it into symbols. Talbot heard it and tried to name it. The world wired it into circuits. Now you've seen it in words. The story ends exactly where it began, inside the human mind, where geometry becomes thought and thought becomes creation. Every time you break a habit, question a rhythm, or silence a feed long enough to hear your own heartbeat, you rewrite a piece of the equation. You change the pattern by seeing it. And if you ever wonder whether it still watches, remember this. The pattern doesn't need eyes or networks or rituals. It only needs one thing, a mind willing to perceive. So let the screen fade. Let the hum return to silence. Carry the awareness instead of the fear. Because the final act of rebellion in a world built on reflection is to look back and not blink. Fade to black. The faint sound of breath. Then silence.